said I would be here 10 minutes early, but the parking is absolutely insane down here today. The Wall Street garage is closed down, and I'm going to need parking there, and I get it there. Well, thank you for having me here. I appreciate it. I figured I'd see a familiar face or two in the crowd. Nashville is such a small place, but I thank Brooke asking me down here, and y'all having me. What we're trying to do is just give some information out and help people make better choices about their health, but you can only make better choices when you know what the way to do things is. And blood sugar, this is what the topic of today's talk is, blood sugar in the brain. Blood sugar is such a poorly understood topic. Everybody's talking about it everywhere you go. People are skipping over the mashed potatoes because they don't want carbs in their diet. And the one message I want to get across here today is that not all sugars or carbohydrates are created equal. We know that. So we're not going to eliminate any one food group just simply because it might put a little weight on the belly. We need to do things a little bit smarter. So about myself, I'm in a bit of a transition right now. You'll see two practice names here. Carolina Functional Neurology is my current practice, and we, by the end of August, will be fully functional as Apex Brain Centers. And what we do are neurological intensive protocols or brain intensive protocols where we see folks for very short periods of time, usually 5 to 10 days, for all types of issues, traumatic brain injury, Parkinson's, dementia. We're also dealing a lot with adults, behavioral and emotional and learning disabilities, so ADD, OCD, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, and that whole realm of conditions. So we're getting people in and we're dealing with neurological rehabilitative protocols like quantitative EEG and neurofeedback, if anybody knows about that. A program called the Interactive Metronome, which deals with sequencing and timing within the brain. And also two metabolic therapies. Metabolic meaning nutritional based therapies. I'm a firm believer. I come from a practice up in New York about 10 years ago. And by the way, just tell me to put on the brakes if I go too fast because I am from up north and tend to get going and you can't stop me. So tell me to put on the brakes if you need to. But I had a large practice up there, have since downsized and got more to quality of care versus quantity of care. When you start out, it's all about wanting to see as many people as you can and get your feet wet and also to be able to make a living. It's all about quality of care now. And with that, we see people on a very high frequency, but we see a very low volume of patients at any given time. When we were in New York, we had everything under one roof: primary care, orthopedics, neurology, massage, acupuncture, chiropractic care, physical therapy, occupational therapy, nurse practitioners, and everybody was there as a team trying to deal with anything that came through the doors. It was a really great approach. Unfortunately, the laws in the state of North Carolina don't allow for that type of entity unless everybody is their own separate PC under one roof, and that gets a little bit dicey when everybody becomes their own little island under one roof. So anyhow, I went into a true private practice, but I maintained really great relationships on the outside because you need to look at all avenues of function. You can't just look at the brain, you can't just look at the gut, you can't just look at the heart. You have to look at everything at the same time. So we have multi-system approaches to healthcare, and that always seems to be the best way to do things. Some people do require very specific interventions at times, but in general, for people that are looking to get healthier, maintain their health, or even deal with serious health issues, the multi-system approach is the best bet. We're focusing on this one aspect of the multi-system approach, and this is more of a metabolic approach to brain health, but it's probably the most important. How many folks have heard what they're calling Alzheimer's disease right now? Anybody know what the new term is for that? What they're calling it? Type 3 diabetes. If you punch in type 3 diabetes and Alzheimer's, you will find you get about 1 million hits come up. This is the new thing, and within the next 5 years or so, in my opinion, this will be an official diagnosis. It's diabetes in the brain, is what it is. Diabetes affects blood vessels. It affects small blood vessels in particular, and we have a lot of small blood vessels in the brain. So when we have a lot of sugar floating around the blood, there's a lot of damage happening to blood vessels. Therefore, the parts of the brain that need the blood and the nutrients and all that good stuff, oxygen, they're not getting it because those blood vessels are getting damaged. So diabetes in the brain is a big issue. Most of these conditions can be brought down to a problem with blood sugar handling. That's why most people with type 2 diabetes, with Alzheimer's, will have type 2 diabetes, or they'll be pre-diabetic. We're seeing people with, if you know the numbers, fasting blood sugar of 200-300. These numbers are off the chart, sometimes upwards of 500, where they need to be on insulin to control it. But the bottom line is if they control the sugar, the brain works better because The brain is the greedy master. That's what it's been termed. It requires a lot of fuel. It requires a consistent supply of fuel. So if it's not getting it, it will malfunction, no doubt about it. So, blood sugar in your brain, what you don't know can hurt you. And again, this is important because we don't want to eliminate a whole category of nutrients just because it might be doing something to our waistline. We need to think smart. That's the key here. So, two things I want you to understand with regard to nerve function. And when I'm saying nerves, I'm talking about nerves in the brain, nerves in the body, so the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Nerves need two things to function appropriately. And this little sensitive. Fuel and activation. We're talking about sugar today, so we're talking about fuel. Now, in terms of fuel, sugar and oxygen are the two primary fuels that the body uses. In particular, today, what we're talking about, what the nervous system uses. So we're talking about the sugar component. So this is all about sugar today. Activation is incredibly important as well, but that's another weekend seminar right there. A few facts on brain fuel. Brains consume an awful lot of energy. For this, 2 to 3 pound mass on the top of your head, which is only about 2% of your body weight, it uses a lot of energy, disproportionate amount of energy. It can use up to 2 times as much energy than other cells like muscle cells, bone cells, things like that. Nerve conduction requires half of the brain's fuel, so half of the fuel, oxygen, and sugar that gets into the brain. The nerve conduction, the electrical activity of that brain requires half of that fuel. So just to kind of get the motor running, you're using half that fuel. Neurons are always metabolically active. So you can put a muscle to rest and it will be relatively inactive. It will still use some energy, but the brain is going all the time, particularly when you're sleeping. You use a lot more in terms of fuel sometimes when you're sleeping than when you're awake. Now, neurons are always metabolically active, so what happens is that means they require a constant source of fuel. And this right here, I don't know if there's a laser on that. Is there a laser? Oh, there we go. Nerve cells cannot store energy. Muscle cells can store energy, other cells can store energy, nerve cells cannot. They use it, it's gone. So they need a constant supply, and that's important to remember because we always need sugar on board. If we go 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hours without eating, like some people do, I talk to folks that aren't eating for 10 hours during the course of the day, that is not good because this requires a constant source of fuel. So, because the brain can't store glucose, it needs a constant supply. Glucose is the only sugar used by the brain. There's all kinds of sugars, but they're all ultimately, as well as proteins and fats, they're all ultimately broken down to glucose. Too little or too much can have devastating consequences. So hypo or hyper glycemic states can have devastating consequences. Complex versus simple carbohydrates. This is where it's at, understanding the differences. And when people talk about carbohydrates being bad, they're typically talking about simple carbohydrates, refined sugars, things like that. We'll talk about the necessity for eliminating and minimizing those, but we need to understand the differences. All kinds of analogies out there about the brain and the nerves and other things, and most of them are highly inaccurate. You hear about the brain being like a computer. The brain's really nothing like a computer when you get down to it. Most neuroscientists will agree on that. They used to use a car analogy for sugars in the brain, but that doesn't really work so well. The closest thing we can relate blood sugar to in terms of analogy is burning paper and wood. So you think about it, you burn a piece of paper, boom, it's gone in an instant. You burn a piece of wood, it'll burn, depending on the density of the wood, how much moisture is in it, all of that type of stuff. It'll have different properties, but by and large, it will burn longer, more efficiently than a piece of paper. You'll get a lot more heat, a lot more quickly out of a piece of paper in that quick instant, but then it's gone. So that's important to understand. So the simple carbohydrates would be that piece of paper burning real quick. The complex carbohydrates would be that log burning for hours. So complex carbohydrates, you have to think metered in or buffered or whatever it takes to understand the concept, but complex carbohydrates have fiber in them, and simple and refined sugars typically don't. Fiber is critically important. Fiber content with sugar intake is critically important because if you don't have fiber with your sugar, the sugar just goes right into the bloodstream very, very rapidly. So if you think of things that have jackets on them, you look at brown rice versus white rice. The brown rice has a jacket, the white rice doesn't. You look at any type of fruit with a skin on it that you can eat. It has a jacket of fiber that you can eat. Look at the most common fruits: cantaloupe, pineapple, watermelon, banana being number one. They don't have jackets on it that you can eat, therefore they're very, very high glycemic index, which we'll talk about, but very, very high in sugar content, very high simple sugar content. So we want to think of this time-released effect, kind of like a pill that you take that will release over time. If you're eating a fruit, say like an apple with the skin on it, it will release much more slowly into the bloodstream than eating that banana, especially more than eating a Snickers bar or something like that. So basically the fiber slows the breakdown of the carbohydrate and release into the bloodstream, found in typically natural food sources, whole foods. Whole foods is kind of a big buzzword. What are whole foods? They're just foods at the source, plants and meats and things like that. So close to the source, not refined, not processed. Because refining and processing often takes out a lot of the good stuff, including the fiber. So basically these are best for the brain, no doubt about it. They should be the primary source of sugar intake. The simple carbohydrates, they explode into the bloodstream. And this is critical because diabetes, which is essentially hyperglycemia, you have too much sugar floating around in the blood. When this happens very often, there's a lot of damage that occurs to blood vessels, which can lead to peripheral neuropathy, it can lead to problems with the eyes, it can lead to problems in the brain, etc. So we want to just maintain a very healthy level of sugar in the blood, just enough for it to be used and not deposited as fat, because if you have a lot of sugar in the blood, it will eventually go to fat. So this is the key. The more simple carbohydrates you eat, the more fat you will deposit and the more damage you will do to your blood vessels. So basically sugar with no jacket, little or no fiber, less breakdown into the bloodstream very rapidly. This would be high glycemic index. People familiar with glycemic index? It's been around for years, and I'm sure you've at least heard the term. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Found primarily in processed and refined food sources. Again, anything that's taken away from that original source. When you take a potato and make it into a potato chip, that's become refined and processed. It's not a potato anymore, really. It's become a little bit different than whole food. So this is the key with simple sugars too. Most simple sugars will not reach, or refined sugars will not reach the blood-brain barrier. So to get that stuff into the brain, you need the good, healthy sugars to do that. If you don't have sugars on board, if you're starving yourself of sugars on Atkins types of diets and others where sugars are restricted completely, your body will start to break down its own protein and fats to get that sugar, which is a very expensive process. It takes your body a lot to break down protein to get sugar out of it. So you waste a lot of energy doing that. Different diets for different people. I know the first question after is which diet's the best. You got Paleo, Atkins, South Beach, everything else like that. I'm not here to promote any particular diet. Everybody has different needs. And we can go on and on about the specific individual needs of everybody, but these are some general guidelines about sugar here today. So processed sugars, high fructose corn syrup, everybody's heard of this. Everybody pretty much understands that this is the enemy these days. It's just not a good thing. When you take a natural sugar source and make it into something it's not, just to heighten the sweetness of it and extend shelf life and all that kind of stuff, obviously there will be some consequences with that because it's no longer a whole food. The official name, by the way, of high fructose corn syrup doesn't sound as attractive. That's why you don't see it on the labels. It's enzymatically altered corn glucose. So, again, and also too, what they're trying to do is simply this huge petitions, millions and millions of dollars. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not up here to tell you things that are out there that are not. But there is absolutely a lobby going forward to label high fructose corn syrup simply as corn sugar on labels, because that sounds even more attractive than high fructose corn syrup, and everybody's on to high fructose corn syrup. So once that happens, it's going to get real confusing because it's going to be hard to separate that from the other sugars. Little or no insulin response. So this stuff goes into the bloodstream. Your pancreas here does not secrete a lot of insulin to grab onto the sugar to pull it into the cells. That's a bad thing because it causes a lot of damage to the cells and it will be deposited as fat. So a lot of the sugar is not being utilized by your cells. It's simply running through the system and wreaking havoc. Will cause damage to blood vessels we've talked about. Another thing, no suppression of appetite. This is why people that eat a lot of refined sugars and high fructose corn syrup, they've got the sweet tooth, so to speak. You can train yourself out of the sweet tooth. It's not that hard. Start eating a lot of high fiber complex carbohydrates and you start to minimize the cravings. But if you're eating Snickers bars all day, I'm sorry, I'm picking on Snickers. I don't like peanuts, so I guess I'm picking on Snickers. But if you're drinking the sodas and all that kind of stuff, you're going to crave more of it because you're not suppressing your appetite with that. When you eat an apple, that type of complex carbohydrate will act on the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. It will suppress your appetite. Most of the stored fat will not reach the blood-brain barrier and avoid at all costs. Label names for sugar, and there are tons more, and look at the print here. I have to make it that small just to get them all on slide. But all kinds of things, lactose, corn syrup solids, dextran, dextrose, dietase, you name it. Sugars have many, many different names. But there's relatively few that you should kind of focus on, and we'll talk about the names of those, like beet sugars and cane sugars. And we'll talk about the amounts as well. If you could just let me know time-wise, I just want to make sure I keep everybody on time. You can just give me a heads up when 10 minutes left or so. Glycemic index, this is what I was talking about. This has been around for a while, and this is an arbitrary measure of how rapidly something gets into your bloodstream, how rapidly something turns into sugar in your bloodstream. So basically, it's based on the kind of the central standard of white bread or glucose. That turns into blood sugar about the same amount of time. So you have above and below that, higher glycemic and lower glycemic. And I'll give you a handout after that. Kind of gives you categories of general foods, fruits and vegetables as far as to whether they're high, medium, or low glycemic index. The key is you want to stick largely towards low glycemic index foods. Now, if you're a competitive cyclist or something like that, there's times where you're going to need high glycemic foods to give you that quick energy you need to kind of get through a wall. But for the average person, you want to stick to low glycemic index foods as much as possible. So this is a measure of the effects of carbohydrates on blood sugar levels. That's the definition. High, just think high, bad, low, good. High is rapid breakdown of the sugar. Low is slow breakdown. So if it's rapid breakdown, would that be a typically simple or complex carbohydrates? Simple. Yep. And slow would be the opposite. So high glycemic diet leads to adult onset diabetes. There's estimates now that 50-60% of the population is pre-diabetic. This is scary stuff. I'm 41 years old, and I remember when I was a kid who had diabetes, and it was my grandmother, my grandfather, my great aunt, my great uncle. It was not my cousins. It was not my brothers and sisters. So I don't have sisters, but it wasn't my brother. But now it's very common. We're seeing kids in their teens being diagnosed with diabetes, and it's heart-wrenching. But I'll tell you, every person that walks through my door and has aspects of dementia, even now Parkinson's, things like that, we're seeing borderline, if not high blood glucose levels. Most people are already coming in on metformin and other diabetes drugs because they have the diabetes. So it's a big problem. And what's the big difference? It's not like our genes changed over the last 50 years or so, or 40 or 30 years, 20 years. It's basically environmentally driven. A lot more stressors in our lives. You can look at this from so many angles, but the biggest things are the dietary changes that have happened over the past 20, 30, 40 years. And that's a lot of processing of foods. Okay? Upwards 50% of the population, even more now, depending on what source you look at. But 50% is kind of the number you'll find on the diabetes, the primary diabetes websites. And what is high glycemic diet? What does that lead to? Most people, one of the most common complaints is this brain fog. People just can't think clearly. They can't do things they used to as efficiently as they can't do things they used to as efficiently anymore. They can't multitask. They can't do what they need to do to get through their day. They get very tired. The crash after lunch type thing. We shouldn't crash like that after lunch. We should be, taking little, naps or breaks in between. But I don't know if you all do that here. We actually, in our practice up in Europe, we had a room where people could go in and sleep and meditate and do whatever they wanted. And well, that's great. That's great. I'll tell you, we had folks that came back at 2 o'clock more productive than they were at 8 in the morning. Imagine that. That's unheard of in most offices. But so brain fog, dementia, cognitive decline, fatigue, so much more attributed to poor blood sugar handling, and that's just on the surface. Get deep, you're looking at thyroid dysfunction, pancreatic dysfunction, all kinds of organic issues. Especially important in the brain injury population. I see a lot of TBI in practice, a lot of traumatic brain injury. These folks develop what's called dysautonomia, and they can't regulate certain bodily functions as well as they used to. It's not just about what's going on in the brain. They can't regulate certain body functions as well anymore, like digestion, calorie usage, and things like that. So for specifically important there, we're seeing so much more of it this day and age with traumatic brain injury. Label readings. So people say, what do we do? What do we do? How do we figure out these sugars? How do we make sense of it? I'll tell you, as much as I know, having studied this for so many years and living it every day, it's still confusing for folks like me because things change all the time as to how things are labeled. So what we want to do is just understand the basics. On any label, you'll see total carbohydrates, fiber, sugar, other sugars, different types of fibers. Forget about all that. There's just a couple of things I want you to pay attention to, at least right now, when you're reading a label. And basically that's sugar and fiber. Sugar, when you see sugar on a label, if it doesn't say added sugars and says sugar, it still means added sugars. So sugar is basically what they're dumping into it after they take the real whole food and do something with it. So added sugars generally are not good, generally not necessary, but they're designed, they're in there for a reason. So you want to typically look at foods that are low sugar, high fiber. That's the key. Avoid corn sugars, processed sugars, sugar substitutes. Sugar substitutes is a talk for another day, but just understand most people are getting away. Diet drinks are within the next 5 years will be the biggest segment of the market. Companies like Coca-Cola and Pepsi and all, they know now their sugar drinks aren't selling as well as they used to, and they're positioning themselves for the next 5 to 10 years to be solely diet driven with very little emphasis on the sugar drinks. I don't know if you ever see Mountain Dew get out of the South. I don't know, but it's important. It's really important. I've seen a lot of Diet Mountain Dews all over the place, but sugar substitutes are particularly from a brain perspective, some of them can be quite troublesome. So look for cane sugars, beet sugars, glucose on the label, unrefined brown sugars, molasses, those types of things. Natural, whole foods, whole sugars. So this is a label right here, typical label. Fiber equals fiber. You may see it broken down into different types of fiber, but just be concerned with that number of the fiber. Really any type of carbohydrate-based food you're eating, like cereals, I'll use cereals as an example. There should be fiber in it. If you pick up Captain Crunch or something, there's not going to be any fiber in there, any usable fiber. So you want to look at the sugars too. Sugars equal added sugar, no matter what. Other carbohydrates, you'll often see that, or you'll see a big discrepancy between total carbohydrates and what's listed. You see total carbohydrates 30, fiber 1, sugar 5. 5 plus 1 is 6. Last I checked, that didn't equal 30. So there's a big discrepancy. You've got 24 grams of sugar unaccounted for. Normally that should be listed as other carbohydrates, but forget that. Here's the simple formula. Look at total carbohydrates minus the sugar. So 30 minus 5 leaves you 25. That tells you right there that there's 25 grams of other carbohydrates. The other carbohydrates are simply starches, binders, usually carbohydrates that don't have much of an effect on your blood sugar at all. It's kind of like when you boil pasta, the thickness that comes out of it. That's the starches. That's the other carbohydrates. So sugars, again, are added. The bigger, right here, generally speaking, the greater the difference between total carbs and sugar, the better the food. So, back to Captain Crunch. I'm going to pick on Captain Crunch. So this would be a pretty decent example right here. Total carbohydrates, 30 grams, and then sugar in something like that would say 28 grams. So you would have a difference of 2, which would be the other sugars. That's really bad because you're looking at 28 grams or so of added sugar. This would be kind of a healthy cereal, maybe some kind of kashi type cereal with a lot of protein, a lot of fiber, and where you would see a 25 gram discrepancy between total carbohydrates and sugar. That means there's a lot of the other carbohydrates in there and very little added sugar. And also, too, the protein is important. You want to make sure you're getting a fair amount of protein at breakfast time so that you're not, for physiological purposes, you utilize blood sugar better. So, again, generally speaking, this is important. The greater the difference between the total carbs and the sugar, the better it is for you. Those are the 2 numbers you need to know. So the bottom line, we've got to limit sugar intake. And when I say sugar intake, we're talking about the refined simple sugars. So just for a little bit more math here, 1 teaspoon equals 4 grams of sugar. The average Coke, we're talking a can, who drinks a can anymore? The average can has about 40 grams of sugar in it. The average can of Mountain Dew, I'll pick on Mountain Dew again, has 46 grams of sugar. So you're talking over 10, 11 teaspoons of sugar in 1 can right there. That's where I used to have the teaspoons with me, just kind of put them on the table and for shock value. But it's amazing how they can even fit that much sugar into that can right there. So that's a lot. you shouldn't be taking in any more than 40 grams of added sugar per day, period. And most people aren't doing the 40 ounce, they're doing the 32 ounce, the 20 ounce and 32 ounce, so just multiply it up and up. And with one drink, you're getting more added sugar than you should have for the entire day, which is not good. That will spike your blood sugar, that will cause your pancreas to become fairly inactive, that will set you up for type 2 diabetes, that will set you up for the brain fog, the cognitive decline, the dementia, and the peripheral neuropathy and all that. And I'm not a gloom and doom type of guy. Please don't get me wrong. I'm not here to throw all this on you and say, this is all bad. But it's about the understanding of sugar, so you can just look at things a little bit differently. I tell folks, whenever you put something to your mouth, drink or otherwise, just say, what is this doing for me? And obviously, if you're Highland Brewing of a beer, it's got to be pretty good, right? But, seriously, next time you put a soda to your lips, just say, what's it doing? And I'm a firm believer in anything in moderation is not going to kill us. Whether it's alcohol, whether it's anything, it's not going to. But anything in excess will. Too much oxygen, too much water, too much alcohol, too much anything will eventually do us in. So anything in moderation. So the occasional soda, once every couple of weeks, I'd rather not see somebody do it, but if you can do it, do it. But it's the repetitive, everyday usage of these types of things. And I'm not even getting into the whole psychological component of this. I see a lot of eating disorders in practice, and we see a lot of brain-driven food choices, and good or bad. And this is important because what happens is foods at their very simplest sense, and drinks included, are chemical messengers, and they tell the brain to do certain things. They impact your DNA at a cellular level. So if you do something all the time to affect your cells in a certain way, they get used to it and they expect it. They get addicted to it. So that's why you crave the sugars if you're living eating that type of diet quite often. So quality versus quantity. This is another thing too. People often say, hear it all the time, I can't eat healthy, I just can't afford to eat healthy. And I understand. You go to Earth Fair, you pay $60 for 2 bags of groceries, whereas you can go to Ingles and fill up your cart for $60. Well, I don't know about that. If you're buying the mac and cheese and the chips and the Mountain Dew, you can. It's different with different crowds, but that's the one thing I get all the time is we just can't afford to eat right. But it's quality versus quantity. If you're getting more complex carbohydrates, you need less simple sugars. It's not about the amount, it's about the quality. So, let's see. Oh, that was it. If you have any questions, where were we at on time?
5 more minutes.
Okay. So I'll just open this up for questions. I know we kind of breezed through it. There's so much to talk about with this. This is really a huge abridged version of what we can do, but I know we were limited on time, so I'll take your questions.
When you're talking about sugars, what are your thoughts on coconut palm sugar?
Again, the whole, I tend to stick with the whole food sources, so absolutely. Coconut is all the rage these days with the coconut sugars and the coconut oils. From a physiological perspective, biochemical perspective, I'm in favor of a lot of the hype going on with coconut sugars and coconut oils, so absolutely. But you want, again, the natural sources. I listed a few, like the beet sugars, the cane sugars, there's sucanut, molasses. The only natural sugar that's really being, singled out as contributing factor because people use so much of it is the honey. We love honey, honey's great, but we need to use honey in moderation. It will spike the blood sugar very rapidly, and people often use too much of it. Particularly if we're doing sweet teas and things like that all the time. We're just using just as much of that as the white stuff. Anybody else? Yeah.
Well, I know we didn't really get into it, but diet drinks and those types of supplemental sweeteners, you say, though they're all bad. Is it better to drink without that? Is it better to go for a regular soda as opposed to a diet soda?
The interesting thing, I was in Brazil 2 years ago. I spent about a month and a half down in Brazil, and I was actually drinking Coke when I was down in Brazil because they use cane sugar in it, and it's not all that bad. And that's all these folks had in their houses, and where we were, you didn't drink the water, so I had to. It was either red wine or Coke, and we reserved the red wine for night. Most days. But with the sugar substitutes, there's there's so much emerging evidence out there. There's still not a lot of proof in this arena. But the thing with a lot of the sugar substitutes is the neurological issues with appetite suppression and things like that. We're finding that with the sugar substitutes, we're not getting the appetite suppression. Therefore, we'll tend to overeat. So from that simple perspective, things like sucralose and some of the stuff, aspartame and all, people aren't using a lot of anymore. People are shifting towards stevia, but then again, it's very hard to find pure stevia because that's often being cut with other stuff. I'm looking at it more from a neurophysiological perspective and shutting down hunger responses and things like that. They're not all created equal in certain eyes and certain experts' opinions. They're not all bad, but there's just not enough evidence to lead me to believe that they're in fact safe. So I would say yes, if you get that urge for something, I would steer towards the one with the normal sugar. Even though it's the white sugar, table sugar, it's still going to have more of an impact on your appetite than the fake sugars will. There's just not enough evidence out there right now to make a firm opinion on that. I'm sorry, who was up first there?
Additional fiber in diets, does that affect the sugars that you're already putting in your body that may not come from the whole foods?
Absolutely. We have folks that are just, for whatever reason, they won't eat a lot of the whole grains and fruits and vegetables and things like that. So we will have them sprinkle the fiber on their cereal just to be able to have that buffer there for the sugar that they are taking in. So added fiber is good in those cases. The bottom line is even people that are eating a fair amount of fiber still aren't getting enough probably, just like with protein as well, and certain fats. We're just not getting nearly enough of them. So I'm for additional fiber. And you have to gauge it accordingly, and you have to look at what's happening on the other end of digestion, what's happening with the stool. If it's too loose or too bound up, you can kind of judge the fiber amounts on that. Yeah.
I know you can get into all kinds of ratios of protein to carbohydrate consumption. But in your opinion, if you're at a place where you want to be and you want to maintenance, you're at a place where you want to be, what ratio, what percentage of your diet should be carbs with the high fiber content in the carbs? What percentage compared to protein?
Well, if you're just loading plates up with vegetables all the time, it should roughly be, there's all kinds of the 40-40-20 and the 40-30-30. It's I don't subscribe to any one particular thing because every person that walks through my doors has a different story. But from a maintenance perspective, I would say likely the kind of 40-30-30 with regard to 40% protein, 30% fat, 30% carbohydrates. But again, the right types of carbohydrates.
Right.
Absolutely.
And the right time for that.
Yeah.
I know everybody's asking the same question. Where does alcohol fit into all this?
Thank you.
Let's have an experiment and see. Where does alcohol fit? Again, anything in moderation, that's the thing. That's what I love about Beer City, USA, is that a lot of people do go overboard, but most people are drinking their alcohol fairly responsibly. And if it's done in that manner, then it's very hard to slam a 12-pack of Razor with or something like it would Bud Light. But yes, it will have an impact on blood sugar, an absolute impact. The alcohol, the sugar alcohols in there, the added sugar, absolutely will have an impact, a very different impact than, say, even refined sugars. But, it needs to be in moderation, spacing them out, absolutely, having some water in between for hydration purposes because the alcohol has a diuretic effect. It needs to be in moderation. And you have the whole, the sugars in the wines and things like that. We know the jury's been out that the red wines in particular are good for us, and they have a lot of properties with regard to antioxidants and blood thinning effects and all that. I have no problem with the glass a day type thing. The glass a day doesn't mean, well, let's save up Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and we'll do all our glasses on Saturday because we know full well binge drinking is the worst thing for so many reasons, not just the liver, but for blood sugar and pancreatic function. Binge drinking is the worst, the absolute worst. Anybody else? Yep.
As a parent of young children, I found your label formula very interesting. I'm wondering, I had always kind of been guided by looking for cereals and other stuff or bars or cereal bars for my kids that maybe when they're not completely up and wholesome, that were less than 10 grams of sugar.
Right.
But since you said, how does that apply? Is that just worthless? is the carb differentiation between the sugars more important? How's that?
You just want to minimize the amount of added sugar. So look at that, where it says sugars, look at that number, because that is added sugar, okay? The total carbohydrates is very deceiving, because there's a lot of things plugged into that. So when it says sugars, that's really the most important factor there.
But is there a number that you want to make sure that's below or above, or is it more the difference?
It really
between the
depends
four?
on the amount of protein in there, the amount of fiber in there. It's hard to, kind of give specific ratios, but you just want that number to be as low as possible. If you're looking at anything over 10 grams or so of sugar per serving, that's a lot. Because remember, the thing is, you don't want to be taking in any more than 40 or so grams of added sugar per day. You bring that to a child, you probably want to keep that more in the range of about 30 grams of sugar per day. So you can kind of keep track of the added sugar per day and figure it out from that perspective. But obviously, if they're eating a cereal that has 15, 20 grams of added sugar for one serving, you've about tapped into their quota for the day right there with one meal. Yep.
So if you only drink alcohol, how much can you drink then?
Very creative. Do you all have a happy hour after this or something? You struck me as that kind of guy. Any other questions?